Story 1. Are you working alone? A few years ago, I worked at a drive-up coffee shop in my small town. It was a small little place that had a closer resemblance to a shack than a legitimate coffee shop. By evening, most people have their coffee fix and things tend to quiet down a bit. One Sunday evening, I was scheduled to close up shop all by myself for the first time. I was pretty new to the job, but I felt confident enough. The shop was dead that evening, no customers for hours, which wasn't unusual for a Sunday night. So I started doing the usual closing chores, sweeping the floors, mopping up, tidying the counter, and things of that nature. In our shop, the cleaning supplies were kept in this little room that you could only get to by going outside. The door to this room was always locked, so I had to take the keys with me every time I went to grab the mop or broom. Because I was going back and forth a lot, I left the employee entrance door unlocked. I wasn't thinking much about security. In a small town like ours, you don't really expect anything bad to happen. I was about an hour away from locking up and heading home when this old Ford truck pulled into the drive-through lane. The driver was an older guy, maybe in his 40s. I didn't find it odd at first, since a lot of our late-night customers are oil rig workers who grab something to keep them awake for their long drives. I slid open the service window, ready to take his order, but what happened next was far from normal. Instead of asking for coffee or a snack, he looked straight at me and asked, "Are you working alone?" The question caught me off guard. I was working alone, but there was no way I was going to admit that to a stranger. I quickly thought of a lie and said, "No, my coworker's just in the back and my manager will be here any minute to take inventory." I tried to sound casual, but inside I was freaking out. He didn't say anything for a moment and just stared at me, then slowly glanced past me into the shop. The way he looked at the slightly ajar employee door behind me sent a wave of fear through me. He gave me this eerie, unsettling smile, then drove forward a bit, signaling that he was going to turn around on the road that ran right next to the open employee door. As soon as his truck was out of my line of sight, I rushed over, slammed the door shut, and locked it tight. I remember my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. Standing inside the coffee shop, absolute fear ran through me. I could hear the gravel crunching under the tires of the truck as it made its way towards the back. There was a moment where it sounded as if the truck had stopped, idling somewhere just out of view. My mind raced. Was he going to try to break in? In a moment of desperation, I raised my voice, trying to inject a confident, cheery tone into it. "Hey Jess, your boyfriend's going to be here any minute to pick you up, right?" I called out, hoping the guy outside would hear me and believe that the coworker I had mentioned was close by. I sat there and listened as the truck just idled. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the truck's engine revved, and I listened with some relief as it seemed to drive off into the night. I stayed there for a few minutes, unmoving, listening intently in case it came back around. When I could no longer hear the truck, I allowed myself to take a breath, my hands still trembling from the encounter. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something really bad could have happened if I hadn't lied about being alone. For the rest of the night, I was on edge. Every little sound made me jump. I kept peeking out the window, half expecting to see his truck parked out there, waiting. When it was finally time to close up, I was terrified of walking across the empty parking lot to my car. The thought that he might still be lurking around somewhere nearby was unbearable. I waited a good while before I finally mustered up the courage to leave the shop. I ran to my car, locked the doors immediately, and drove home as fast as I could. The whole way back, I kept checking my rearview mirror, paranoid that I was being followed. That experience was by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me at work. It was like one of those horror stories you hear about but never think will happen to you. The way he asked if I was alone, the way he looked at the door behind me, and that smile. It was all just too much. There was a tremendous lesson to be learned from the experience. My coworkers and I would never work alone in the coffee shop at closing time ever again, especially at dark. I guess you can never be too careful, even in a small, quiet town.
Story 2. A Late Night Withdrawal. You know how you sometimes get that gut feeling that something's just not right? I've learned to trust that instinct. The incident I'm about to talk about happened a few winters ago. That day was normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Customers came and went, transactions were smooth, and the staff chatted about weekend plans. It was a Friday evening, and at our bank, the lobby closes at 5 p.m. and the drive-thru closes at 6. Typically, the last of the employees start funneling out around 6:45 to 7. As the manager of the bank, I still had a lot of work to do. Paperwork and such that I put off just a little bit too long. We do have Saturday morning hours where we're open, but I really wanted to just finish up and not have anything carry into the weekend, or even worse, spill into Monday morning. At our bank, we have this ironclad rule: nobody leaves alone after it gets dark. Being as it was the dead of winter, at 5:30 it's already dark. Nevertheless, I watched as the last employee walked to his car around 7:15, and I reassured him that I'd be fine. "It's a safe neighborhood," I told him. "I'll lock up tight and head out soon." I wasn't usually one to break protocol, but I figured, what's the harm? It's peaceful here, and nothing ever really happens. Time flew as I got absorbed in my work. The bright light of my computer screen and the sound of shuffling papers were my only company. I didn't even notice it had gotten so late until I finally looked up to see that it was almost 9 p.m. I started packing up, shutting everything down, and getting ready to head out when I noticed something odd: an unfamiliar car parked too close for comfort next to mine in the parking lot. It was an older model, nondescript, but for some reason, it set off alarms in my head. Something just felt off. I decided not to head straight out. Instead, I watched from behind the blinds, trying to make sense of why the car was there. After a short time, a man stepped out. He was middle-aged, with a rough look about him, wearing clothes that were dark, and a hood that concealed much of his face. He slowly and discreetly made his way over, and then ambled over to the bank's front door and started peering in through the glass. My heart started hammering against my ribs as I crouched behind a partition wall, out of sight. At first, he slowly raised his hand and pressed it against the window to shield any reflective light as he peered through the glass. He scanned back and forth, looking inside. After he cautiously surveyed the interior through the window, his gaze shifted, and he began looking around behind him. It was as though he was assessing his surroundings, ensuring that no prying eyes were about to see his next move. Once seemingly satisfied that he was in the clear, he subtly reached for the door. With another quick glance over his shoulder, he began to shake the door handle in a determined manner. Thankfully, it was securely locked. For a moment, he stepped back into the shadows, and a slight sense of relief came over me, as I foolishly thought he might be giving up. But instead of returning to his car, he did something unexpected. He walked around to the other side of the building, out of view. Dread washed back over me as I debated what to do. I just wanted the man to leave, but his actions indicated that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. If I called the cops, it would have to be reported up, and I could be fired for breaking our nobody leaves alone ironclad rule. Before I could ponder any further, though, a sudden banging erupted from the back door. It was violent, purposeful, and it echoed through the empty bank like a warning. In that moment, any hesitation I had vanished. I dialed 911, my voice a whisper as I described the situation and my location. As the seconds ticked by, the banging got louder and more persistent. "Hurry," I exclaimed to the operator in as forceful of a whisper as I could manage. After what felt like forever, flashing lights finally painted the walls of the bank, and I could hear the cops outside yelling for the man to lay down and put his hands behind his back. Moments later, I was outside giving my statement to the cops as they ushered the man into the back of a car. As I was talking to one of the officers, another one approached. "You're lucky," the cop said to me. "The guy was armed with a knife and has several warrants out for his arrest." I locked up the bank, watched the police drive away with the man, and sat in my car for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. As expected, the incident had to be reported up, and I was disciplined severely. To be honest, I was surprised that I wasn't fired altogether. I'd risked a lot by staying alone, all because I thought my little corner of the world was immune to danger. I learned that security isn't just about locks and alarms. It's about vigilance, and sometimes about following the rules meant to protect us. Never again would I ignore the policy of not leaving alone. Sometimes, the rules that we think are unnecessary are the ones that can save our lives.
Story 3. Close call. At the dealership. Long ago, I worked at a large car dealership just outside the center of the city in Dallas. I knew every corner of that place, every car, every creaky door. On this particular night, I was the last out. It was just me and the quiet hum of the showroom. All set to close up shop, I started through my routine locking doors, turning off TVs, and flipping off lights. As I was approaching one of the hallways, though, a guttural sound froze me in my tracks. It came from the back hallway where the work bays and offices are nestled side by side. What in the hell was that? I thought to myself. Could it be an animal? Or worse, an intruder? I shook off the fear, turned the light back on, and called out a tentative, "Hello?" No answer. So I flipped the light off again, telling myself it was nothing. As I made my way to the door to let myself out, there it was again. That sound. Unmistakable this time. It wasn't just in my head. My pulse began to quicken as I began to realize that I wasn't alone. Someone was in here with me. I called out again, loud this time. "Who's there? There shouldn't be anyone in here." And with a lie, I called out, "I've called the cops." Again, there was no response. At this point, I had to call someone. The owner's phone went straight to voicemail. Great, I thought to myself. I dialed up one of the sales guys. "I'm about 9 or 10 minutes away," he said. "Call the cops or wait for me." I opted to wait, but every second felt like an hour. Sitting in the dark showroom, the only light was the red glow of the emergency exit sign. I felt like I was in one of those horror movies where you're screaming at the character to run. Then I heard it again, a large man's voice, a grunt, like someone was in pain or something. I edged towards the hallway, shouting out that I had called the cops, hoping whoever it was would just leave. Again, there was no response. If this were an employee, they would have made themselves known by now, I thought to myself. It had to be an intruder. Whoever it was, they seemed to be hell-bent on accomplishing whatever it was that they were doing. Silence hung in the air until the motion-activated office lights flickered on. My nerves were shot. I bolted back towards the front door, but there was just one problem. The locks on our doors have to be locked and unlocked with a key, even from the inside. My keys, though, were in an office down the hallway next to the intruder. There was no way that I was going back down there. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, an umbrella, and braced myself. Time crawled. Every second felt stretched out, my mind conjuring up every possible nightmare scenario. Then, the sound of a doorknob turning cut through the silence. A shadow loomed into the hallway, the light from the office outlining a decently sized man. He clicked something and the light snapped off. Instinctively, I yelled out about the police, but my warning was drowned out by a thunderous boom behind me. I nearly leaped out of my skin, stumbled, and whirled around to see it was the salesman at the door, his idea of a knock sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. He unlocked the door with his keys and burst in, self-defense gun drawn, the whole 9 yards, and commanded the shadowy figure to show his hands. Finally, the light to the hallway flicked back on, and there he was. The parts manager, in an oversized shirt that had seen better days, looking as startled as us. With his hands raised, he signed, "Stop pointing that thing at me." And that's when it hit me. Joe, our parts manager, was deaf. I'd completely forgotten that earlier in the day he'd told me that he was going to stay late to finish up some work. Relief washed over me, mixed with the extremely heavy dose of embarrassment. From that day on, the guys at the dealership never let me live it down, always ready with a jump scare, chuckling as I nearly jumped out of my skin. All joking aside, a gun was pointed at someone and something terrible could have happened due to my neglect. Sure, I was embarrassed, but in that moment, the fear was real. In the end, though, I'm glad everything sorted itself out and nobody got hurt. Things certainly could have been much worse.